Here is a land of islands, born from a divine spear dipped into the chaotic sea. A nation that for centuries remained a phantom to the Western world, a whisper of gold and mystery on the far edge of the map they called Zipangu. To the first outsiders who breached its shores, it was a world of bewildering contradictions, a society governed by elaborate ceremonies and a warrior's unforgiving code. At the dawn of the 18th century, its heart was the city of Edo, a sprawling metropolis of wood and water, home to over 1 million souls. It was the largest city on the planet, yet it was not the seat of the nation's divine ruler. The emperor, a god in human form, lived in secluded splendor hundreds of miles away. Edo was the headquarters of a military dictatorship, the unassailable fortress of a power that had commanded Japan for centuries. This is the story of that power, and of the men who embodied it. It is a chronicle of their rise, from provincial obscurity to masters of a nation. It is a tale written in blood and ink, of epic clan warfare that tore the country apart, and of an iron-willed peace that held it together for 2.5 centuries. It is the story of a unique class of warrior, the samurai, who lived by a code of honor and death, whose loyalty was absolute and whose weapon was an extension of their very soul. From the age of gods and shaman queens through centuries of civil war to the rise of 3 of the greatest military leaders in history who would unify a nation. From the gilded peace of a locked country to the thunderous arrival of foreign ships that would shatter its isolation and bring the age of the warrior to a violent, dramatic close. This is the story of the samurai and the shoguns of Japan, the age of gods and early kings. The story of Japan begins in the mists of mythology, in a time before written records, an era chronicled in the Kojiki, the record of ancient matters. It tells of a formless, oily chaos that separated into heaven and earth. From this division emerged the first gods, the kami. Generations of deities came and went until 2 were given a sacred task, the divine siblings, Izanagi and his younger sister, Izanami. Standing on the floating bridge of heaven, they plunged a jeweled spear into the churning brine below. As they withdrew it, the drops that fell from its tip hardened and became the first island, Onogoro. They descended to this island, erected a heavenly pillar, and in a sacred ritual they circled it and procreated. From their union were born the islands of the Japanese archipelago and the countless kami who inhabited them, the gods of the mountains, the rivers, the trees, and the winds. Their final and most radiant child was Amaterasu Omikami, the sun goddess. But her birth came at a terrible cost, as it killed her mother, Izanami. Distraught, Izanagi followed his wife to Yomi, the land of the dead, a dark and polluted underworld. He found her, but broke his promise not to look at her, only to see a rotting, maggot-eaten corpse. Horrified, he fled, sealing the entrance to Yomi behind him and forever separating the worlds of the living and the dead. Returning to the world of light, Izanagi purified himself in a river. From the washing of his left eye, Amaterasu was born, from his right eye, the moon god Tsukuyomi, and from his nose, the violent storm god Susanoo. Amaterasu was given dominion over the heavens, a celestial ruler whose light gave life to the world. Her reign was challenged by her tempestuous brother Susanoo, who unleashed destruction upon her sacred rice fields and weaving halls. In grief and anger, the sun goddess retreated into a rock cave, plunging the world into an endless, terrifying night. The 80 myriads of gods gathered in alarm. They devised a plan, placing a mirror and jewels before the cave and having a goddess perform a riotous, bawdy dance that sent the heavens roaring with laughter. Piqued by curiosity, Amaterasu peeked out. The gods showed her her own reflection in the mirror, and as she stepped forward, mesmerized by her own brilliance, they sealed the cave behind her, restoring light and order to the universe. It was Amaterasu's grandson, Ninigi no Mikoto, who would bring divine rule to the terrestrial world. Bestowed with the three sacred treasures, the mirror that had lured his grandmother from her cave, a curved jewel, and the legendary sword Kusanagi that Susanoo had plucked from the tail of an eight-headed serpenther, descended from the heavens to the island of Kyushu. He was the first divine ruler on earth, tasked with pacifying the land and establishing a dynasty that would last for ages eternal. This fundamental myth, the descent of the gods to create a nation ruled by a divine emperor, would become the bedrock of Japanese identity and the ultimate source of political legitimacy for millennia. History begins to emerge from the mists in the 3rd century of the Common Era. Contemporary Chinese court chronicles, the records of a powerful and literate civilization, speak of a land they called Wa, a patchwork of chiefdoms across the sea. The most powerful of these was a kingdom called Yamato, and it was ruled by a figure of immense spiritual authority, the shaman queen Himiko. The Chinese accounts describe her as an unmarried recluse who occupied herself with magic and sorcery. She lived in a heavily guarded palace, attended by 1,000 women, with a single male intermediary to communicate her will to the outside world. Though she remained unseen, her power was undeniable. She unified the tribes of Yamato under her rule and, crucially, engaged in diplomacy. She sent emissaries bearing tribute on the long and perilous journey to the Chinese imperial court, acknowledging the emperor's supremacy in exchange for recognition and prestige. The Chinese emperor, in turn, bestowed upon her a golden seal and the title Queen of Wa, friendly to Wei. Himiko represents a fascinating early chapter of Japanese history, a time of female spiritual leadership and a clear, if subordinate, connection to the great continental power. Over the next few centuries, the disparate chiefdoms of Japan gradually coalesced into a more unified state centered in the Yamato Plain, near modern-day Osaka and Nara. This was the Kofun period, named for the massive keyhole-shaped burial mounds, or kofun, built for the ruling elite earthen monuments that attest to the growing power and organizational capacity of the Yamato kings. During this time, a steady stream of culture, technology, and ideas flowed into Japan from the more advanced civilizations of Korea and China. Korean artisans brought sophisticated techniques in pottery and metalworking. Scribes introduced the Chinese writing system, a complex ideographic script that Japan, having no native written language, would adopt and adapt for its own use. The most transformative import of all arrived in the mid-6th century, Buddhism. Sent as a gift from a Korean king seeking an alliance, it was a profound and sophisticated philosophical and religious system, complete with sacred texts, intricate art, and a rich intellectual tradition. Its arrival sparked a fierce debate at the Yamato court. Conservative clans, like the Mononobe, who oversaw the traditional Shinto religious rites, saw it as a dangerous foreign intrusion. Progressive clans, most notably the Soga, championed its adoption, seeing it as a hallmark of continental civilization and a powerful tool for state building. The conflict was settled, as it often would be in Japan, by force. The Soga clan triumphed, and Buddhism began its long history as a major force in Japanese culture. This period of profound change found its greatest champion in Prince Shotoku, who served as regent from 594 to 622. A devout Buddhist and a brilliant statesman, Shotoku was the architect of early Japanese statehood. Deeply influenced by Chinese Confucian ideals of a centralized, bureaucratic state, he sought to transform the loose coalition of clans into a more cohesive nation. In 604, he issued the 17-article constitution, not a legal document in the modern sense, but a set of moral and ethical injunctions for government officials, emphasizing principles like harmony, duty, and obedience to the sovereign. Shotoku promoted Buddhism as a state religion, building magnificent temples, and he re-established formal relations with China, sending large-scale official embassies to the court of the Sui dynasty. These missions brought back not just knowledge of Buddhism and Confucianism, but also of Chinese models of law, government, art, and architecture, laying the cultural and political foundations for the classical Japanese state. The rise of the warrior class. Following the reforms of Prince Shotoku, Japan entered its classical age. The capital was moved to Nara in 710, a city built as a miniature replica of the great Tang Chinese capital, Chang'an. It was a city of magnificent Buddhist temples and a burgeoning aristocracy. In 794, the court moved again to a new, grander city named Heian, the capital of peace and tranquility, which would later be known as Kyoto. For nearly 400 years, the Heian period would be an era of extraordinary artistic and cultural refinement among the court nobility. Life for the high aristocracy in Heian was a world away from the concerns of the common people. It was an existence dedicated to the pursuit of aesthetic beauty, or courtly elegance. A nobleman's worth was judged not by his martial prowess, but by his ability to compose a witty, elusive poem on the spot, to identify the subtle blend of perfumes, or to play a musical instrument with skill. 2. They lived in a world of silk robes, elaborate ceremonies, and clandestine love affairs conducted through exquisitely crafted letters written on colored paper. The great literary masterpiece of this era, The Tale of Genji, written by the court lady Murasaki Shikibu around the year 1000, chronicles this insular, hyper-refined world in meticulous detail. While the emperor and his courtiers in Kyoto focused on aesthetics, they neglected the practicalities of governance. They gradually lost control of the provinces, which they viewed as a remote and rustic backwater. The land itself became concentrated in the hands of powerful aristocratic families and wealthy Buddhist monasteries, who established vast, tax-exempt private estates known as shun. The court in Kyoto was becoming isolated, a beautiful but hollow shell. To manage these sprawling estates and protect them from bandits and rival landowners, the estate holders needed armed men. They began to hire provincial fighters, men who made their living through the practice of arms. These were the first bushi, or warriors. At first, they were little more than hired swords, rough men from the frontiers. But over time, the most successful of these warrior families began to accumulate power and influence in their own right. They developed their own distinct culture, one that valued martial skill, physical toughness, and unwavering loyalty above all else. They were developing into a new hereditary warrior class, the samurai. Their code was forged in the harsh realities of provincial life. While the courtier prized elegant verse, the samurai prized the ability to use a bow from horseback. While the courtier sought promotion through social connections, the samurai sought it through valor on the battlefield. Their entire existence was predicated on a relationship of service and reward. A samurai pledged his absolute loyalty in military service to a more powerful lord. In return, the lord provided him with sustenance, usually a grant of land and its income. This bond of loyalty between lord and vassal became the central pillar of samurai society. This nascent warrior class was dominated by a few great clans, most notably the Taira and the Minamoto, both of whom could trace their lineage to demoted members of the imperial family who had been sent out to the provinces centuries before. They were the emperor's distant cousins, but their power came not from their bloodline, but from the thousands of loyal samurai warriors who followed their banners. By the 12th century, these two great clans had become the dominant military powers in the land, and the increasingly feeble imperial court found itself forced to rely on them to enforce its will and settle its own internal disputes. The age of the poet and the courtier was ending. The age of the warrior was about to begin. The Genpei War and the first shogun, the tipping point came in the mid-12th century. A series of bitter succession disputes within the imperial family itself erupted into open conflict. In the Hogan Rebellion of 1156, and again in the Heiji Rebellion of 1160, the cloistered world of the Kyoto court was shattered by violence. The opposing court factions, unable to fight for themselves, called upon the great samurai clans to be their champions. The streets of the refined capital ran red with blood as the warriors of the Taira and Minamoto clans battled for supremacy. The Taira, led by the shrewd and ambitious Taira no Kiyomori, emerged victorious. He ruthlessly eliminated his Minamoto rivals, executing their leaders and exiling their young sons, including a boy named Minamoto no Yoritomo. Kiyomori became the most powerful man in Japan, the de facto ruler. He and his Taira clansmen moved into the capital, taking high court ranks, marrying into the imperial family, and accumulating vast wealth and power. They had, in effect, replaced the Fujiwara aristocracy. But in doing so, they made a fatal error. They began to emulate the very courtiers they had displaced, trading their warrior's edge for the silken robes and refined pastimes of the capital. They became arrogant and complacent, forgetting that their power came from the sword, not from a courtly title. Their arrogance bred deep resentment among the other samurai clans and even within the imperial family. In 1180, an aging, disgruntled prince issued a call to arms, urging what remained of the Minamoto clan to rise up and destroy the tyrannical Taira. The call was answered by Minamoto no Yoritomo, the boy Kiyomori had exiled decades before, now a hard, calculating man with a long memory. From his base in the eastern province of Kamakura, Yoritomo raised the white banner of the Minamoto clan, igniting one of the most celebrated and tragic conflicts in Japanese history, the Genpei War. The war raged across Japan for 5 long years. It was an epic struggle that pitted clan against clan, brother against brother. Yoritomo, the stern strategist, remained in Kamakura, building a new kind of warrior government, a bakufu, or tent government, based on direct bonds of loyalty with his samurai vassals. The brilliant military command of the Minamoto forces fell to his younger half-brother, a man who had become one of Japan's most revered and romanticized heroes, Minamoto no Yoshitsune. Yoshitsune was a military genius. Dashing, charismatic, and a master of surprise and deception, he led the Minamoto armies to a string of astonishing victories. At the Battle of Ichi-no-Tani, he led a small detachment of cavalry on a perilous descent down a steep cliff face to attack the Taira stronghold from the rear, sowing panic and crushing their forces. At the Battle of Yashima, he used clever tricks and a daring amphibious assault to dislodge the Taira from their coastal fortress. His legend grew with each victory, earning him the adoration of his men and the respect of the emperor. The war reached its dramatic and tragic climax in 1185 at the naval battle of Dan-no-Ura, in the narrow strait separating the islands of Honshu and Kyushu. Here, the entire Taira clan, their backs to the sea, made their final, desperate stand. With them on their ships were the 6-year-old child emperor, Antoku, and the 3 sacred treasures. As the tide turned against them and the Minamoto forces overwhelmed their fleet, the Taira leaders realized all was lost. Rather than face the shame of capture, they chose death. One by one, Taira warriors and noblewomen leaped into the swirling, unforgiving currents. The emperor's grandmother, a Taira matriarch, took the young emperor Antoku in her arms. According to the epic war tale, the tale of the Heike, she told the boy, "In the depths of the ocean is our capital," and then plunged with him into the waves. The child emperor, the sacred sword, and the jewel were lost to the sea. The Taira clan, once the proud rulers of Japan, was utterly annihilated. The Minamoto were victorious, but the celebrations were short-lived. The very brilliance of Yoshitsune had become a threat to his older brother. Yoritomo, ever the cold and paranoid strategist, saw his popular, charismatic brother, now a hero in the eyes of the emperor, as a potential rival. He accused Yoshitsune of ambition and disloyalty. Declaring his own brother an enemy of the state, he dispatched assassins to kill him. Yoshitsune was forced to flee, becoming a hunted fugitive. After a series of harrowing escapes and adventures that would become the stuff of legend and kabuki plays, he was finally cornered by Yoritomo's forces and, at the age of 30, committed seppuku. With all his rivals, including his own heroic brother, now dead, Minamoto no Yoritomo was the undisputed master of Japan. He had no interest in the refined life of the Kyoto court. His power base was in Kamakura, among his loyal samurai vassals. In 1192, the now powerless imperial court bestowed upon him the ancient title he demanded, Sei Itai Shogun, or Barbarian, subduing generalissimo. Traditionally, a temporary title granted for a specific military campaign, Yoritomo transformed it into a permanent, hereditary position. He was now the military dictator of Japan. He established his Kamakura shogunate as the true center of power, handling all matters of law, land, and military affairs, while leaving the emperor in Kyoto with his ceremonial duties. The dual system of government that would characterize Japan for the next 7 centuries was now in place. A sacred but powerless emperor in Kyoto and a powerful military ruler, the shogun, holding the real authority. The age of the samurai had officially begun. The Mongol invasions and the fall of Kamakura. The Kamakura shogunate, established by Yoritomo, brought a new era of stability to Japan. It was a government by and for the warrior class, a stark, military-focused administration that valued duty and discipline over the aestheticism of the old court. After Yoritomo's death, however, his sons proved to be ineffectual leaders. Real power was swiftly usurped by the family of his shrewd and capable wife, Hojo Masako. Her clan, the Hojo, established a regency, ruling Japan from behind the scenes for over a century, controlling a series of puppet shoguns just as the Fujiwara had once controlled puppet emperors. Under the firm hand of the Hojo regents, the shogunate governed effectively. But in the late 13th century, Japan faced a terrifying and unprecedented threat, a danger from beyond the sea that would test the samurai to their very limits. From the vast steppes of Asia, the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in human history, had emerged. Its leader, the great Khan Kublai, grandson of the legendary Genghis Khan, had conquered China and Korea and now cast his ambitious gaze eastward, toward the islands of Japan. In 1268, Kublai Khan sent envoys to Japan, demanding the King of War submit to his authority and become a tributary state of the Mongol Empire. The imperial court in Kyoto was terrified, but the Hojo regents in Kamakura responded with defiant silence. They would not bow to a foreign ruler. After several more rejected demands, the Khan's patience ran out. In the autumn of 1274, he unleashed his invasion force. A massive fleet carrying some 40,000 Mongol, Chinese, and Korean troops set sail from the Korean peninsula. They were an intimidating professional fighting force equipped with powerful composite bows, catapults, and explosive clay-cased bombs. They overwhelmed the Japanese garrisons on the islands of Tsushima and Iki, and then landed at Hakata Bay on the northern coast of Kyushu. The local samurai mobilized to meet them. The Japanese warriors were accustomed to a highly ritualized form of combat that emphasized individual heroism. A samurai would ride forward, announce his lineage, and challenge a worthy opponent to a one-on-one duel. The Mongols had no time for such niceties. They advanced in tightly disciplined, organized formations, coordinated by drumbeats and gongs. They rained down arrows in a dense, continuous barrage and hurled their gunpowder bombs, which terrified the Japanese horses and men. The samurai fought with incredible bravery, but they were outmaneuvered and outnumbered, pushed back from the coast. The situation looked grim. The main invasion force was poised to press its advantage the next day. But overnight, a storm of tremendous violence descended upon the bay. The Mongol fleet, comprised of flat-bottomed river ships ill-suited for the open ocean, was devastated. The ships were smashed against the rocks or driven out to sea and sunk. The invasion was crippled. What was left of the Mongol army limped back to the mainland. The samurai believed their gods had intervened to protect them. The Hojo regents knew the Mongols would return. For the next 7 years, they undertook a massive national defense project. They built a great stone wall nearly 20 kilometers long along the coast of Hakata Bay, designed to prevent the enemy from landing. They trained their samurai in group fighting tactics and prepared for a second, even larger invasion. It came in the summer of 1281. This time, Kublai Khan sent 2 enormous fleets, one from Korea and one from southern China, a combined force of over 4,400 ships and an estimated 140,000 men known of the largest seafaring invasion forces in history until modern times. For weeks, the samurai defenders, fighting from behind their newly constructed wall, managed to hold off the invaders in a bloody stalemate. The Mongols could not breach the defenses, but the Japanese could not drive them away. Then, on the night of August 15th, history repeated itself on a truly epic scale. A massive typhoon of unimaginable fury slammed into the coast of Kyushu. For 2 days, the storm raged, annihilating the Mongol armada. Ships were smashed into one another, driven ashore, and swallowed by the sea. The fleet was obliterated. The vast majority of the invasion force drowned. The few thousand who washed ashore were mercilessly hunted down and killed by the samurai. Japan had been saved again. The Japanese, profoundly grateful, named the storm Kamikaze, the divine wind, believing their nation was protected by the gods and therefore invincible. The defense against the Mongols, though successful, came at a ruinous cost. The shogunate had spent vast sums on the defense, and now it had no new lands or wealth to distribute as rewards to the thousands of samurai who had fought so bravely. Discontent began to fester among the warrior class. The shogunate was financially and politically weakened. This weakness was exploited by an ambitious and determined emperor, Go-Daigo. Unlike his passive predecessors, Go-Daigo dreamed of breaking the power of the samurai and restoring the emperor to his rightful place as the true ruler of Japan. In 1331, he raised a rebellion against the Kamakura shogunate. Though initially defeated and exiled, his cause attracted disgruntled samurai from across the country. One of his key generals, Ashikaga Takauji, a powerful vassal of the shogunate, turned against his masters and attacked the Hojo garrison in Kyoto. At the same time, another loyalist general attacked the capital of Kamakura itself. In 1333, the city fell, and the last of the Hojo regents committed suicide. The Kamakura shogunate, after nearly 150 years, was destroyed. Emperor Go-Daigo's triumph, known as the Kenmu Restoration, was short-lived. He sought to create a government modelled on the ancient imperial court, giving power and privilege to his court nobles while neglecting the very samurai who had won him the victory. This alienated his most powerful supporter, Ashikaga Takauji. Feeling betrayed and slighted, Takauji turned on the emperor. In 1336, he drove Go-Daigo from Kyoto and placed a rival member of the imperial family on the throne. Go-Daigo fled to the mountains south of Nara and established a rival court, creating a situation where two rival emperors claimed legitimacy. In 1338, Ashikaga Takauji had his puppet emperor grant him the title of shogun. He established his new shogunate not in Kamakura, but in the Muramachi district of Kyoto itself. The Ashikaga shogunate would rule, or attempt to rule, Japan for the next 240 years. But their authority was never as firm as their Kamakura predecessors. They were forced to rely on a decentralized system of alliances with powerful regional military governors, the shugo, who over time evolved into independent feudal lords, the daimyo. The Ashikaga shogunate presided over a great cultural flourishing, particularly in the realm of Zen Buddhism, which profoundly influenced samurai culture, giving rise to art forms like no theatre, the tea ceremony, and inkwash painting. But politically, it was an era of endemic instability, a slow, steady erosion of central authority that would ultimately lead Japan into its most violent and chaotic century. The Age of Warring States. The fragile authority of the Ashikaga shoguns finally shattered completely in 1467. A succession dispute within the shogun's own family escalated into a full-blown civil war between two of the most powerful daimyo clans, the Hosokawa and the Yamana. This conflict, the Onin War, raged for over a decade, fought primarily in the streets of Kyoto itself. The once magnificent capital was utterly devastated, its palaces and temples burned to the ground. The shogun was rendered a powerless figurehead, and his government ceased to function. The Onin War was the starting gun for the Sengoku Jidaichi Age of Warring States. For more than a century, Japan was plunged into a state of continuous, brutal warfare. The country fractured into hundreds of independent domains, each ruled by a daimyo who was, in effect, a king in his own right. The old order was completely destroyed. It was an age of Gekkokujo, the low overthrowing the high, a time of unprecedented social mobility and treacherous violence. Loyal vassals murdered their lords to seize their domains. Ambitious sons overthrew their fathers. Alliances were made and broken in an instant. The only law was the law of the sword, and the only goal was survival and the expansion of one's own power. From this crucible of chaos and blood, three of the most remarkable figures in all of Japanese history would emerge. Three daimyo of vastly different temperaments who would, in sequence, drag the fractured nation, kicking and screaming toward unification. Their names were Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. The first of the great unifiers was Oda Nobunaga, the lord of the small province of Owari. Nobunaga was a force of nature brilliant, ruthless, and utterly terrifying. Contemptuous of tradition and religion, he was a brutal pragmatist who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. He adopted a personal seal that read Tenkafubu, rule the empire by force, and it was a promise he intended to keep. His rise began in 1560 with one of the most famous surprise attacks in samurai history. At the Battle of Okahazama, a neighboring daimyo, Imagawa Yoshimoto, invaded Owari with a massive army of 25,000 men. Nobunaga could only muster about 3,000. Rather than defend his castle, Nobunaga led his small force on a bold flanking march during a thunderstorm. He launched a surprise attack directly on the Imagawa headquarters, catching them completely off guard. Imagawa himself was killed, and his army disintegrated. Nobunaga had not just survived, he had established himself as a major power. Over the next 2 decades, Nobunaga expanded his domain through a relentless series of campaigns. He was a master of innovative tactics and technology. He was one of the first daimyo to fully embrace the potential of the firearm. While many traditionalist samurai scorned the arquebus as a dishonorable weapon fit only for low-born foot soldiers, Nobunaga saw its revolutionary power. At the pivotal Battle of Nagashino in 1575, he faced the formidable cavalry of the Takeda clan, widely considered the most powerful cavalry in Japan. Nobunaga constructed simple wooden barricades and armed 3,000 of his soldiers with muskets. He arranged them in rotating ranks. As the Takeda cavalry charged, they were met with a continuous, disciplined volley of gunfire. The charge was broken, and the once invincible Takeda army was annihilated. Nobunaga had demonstrated that disciplined, organized infantry with firearms could defeat the most elite samurai cavalry. The age of heroic one-on-one duels was over. Nobunaga was as ruthless with his domestic enemies as he was with his battlefield foes. He reserved a special hatred for the powerful and militant Buddhist monasteries who fielded their own armies of warrior monks and resisted his authority. In 1571, he surrounded the sacred monastery complex on Mount Hiei, the historic center of Tendai Buddhism, and burned it to the ground, slaughtering an estimated 3,000 to 4,000 men, women, and children without mercy. He was known as the Demon King to his enemies. But he was also a patron of the arts and a brilliant administrator who stimulated commerce by abolishing tolls and opening free markets. He was the brutal, visionary force necessary to shatter the old feudal order. By 1582, Nobunaga controlled all of central Japan and was on the verge of unifying the entire country. But his end came not from an outside enemy, but from within his own inner circle. While resting at the Onnoji Temple in Kyoto with only a small retinue of bodyguards, he was betrayed by one of his most trusted generals, Akechi Mitsuhide. The reasons for the betrayal are still debated by historians: a personal grudge, a public insult, or sheer ambition. Surrounded by thousands of Akechi's troops, with the temple in flames and no hope of escape, the 47-year-old Oda Nobunaga, the great destroyer and unifier, committed seppuku. Into the power vacuum stepped the second great unifier, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Hideyoshi's story is one of the most extraordinary tales of social mobility in Japanese history. He was born a peasant, the son of a foot soldier with no family name. Small and famously monkey-faced, he began his career as a lowly servant in Nobunaga's army, allegedly carrying his master's sandals. But through sheer intelligence, boundless energy, and an uncanny ability to read and manipulate people, he rose through the ranks to become Nobunaga's most capable and trusted general. When news of Nobunaga's death at Honnoji reached him, Hideyoshi was campaigning hundreds of miles away. He acted with lightning speed. He quickly made peace with his enemy, force-marched his army back toward Kyoto at an incredible pace, and confronted the traitor Akechi Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki. He crushed Akechi's forces and avenged his master, positioning himself as Nobunaga's rightful successor. Over the next few years, Hideyoshi outmaneuvered and defeated Nobunaga's other senior retainers and sons. Where Nobunaga had ruled through terror, Hideyoshi ruled through a shrewd combination of force, diplomacy, and extravagant displays of wealth. He completed the unification of Japan that his master had begun, subduing the last of the defiant daimyo clans in the south and east by 1590. For the first time in over a century, Japan was at peace under a single ruler. Yet, one thing eluded him. He could never become shogun. The title was reserved for those who could claim descent from the ancient Minamoto clan. Hideyoshi, the son of a peasant, could not invent such a lineage. Instead, he had the emperor appoint him to the highest court positions: imperial regent, kanpaku, and grand minister of state, daijo daijin. He ruled as the absolute dictator of Japan. To cement his rule and prevent the kind of social upheaval that had allowed him to rise, Hideyoshi implemented a series of profound social reforms. He froze the social classes, decreeing that a samurai could not become a peasant and a peasant could not become a merchant or a warrior. He instituted a massive nationwide sword hunt, confiscating weapons from the entire peasantry to prevent uprisings. He also conducted a comprehensive land survey, a monumental undertaking that reassessed the value and ownership of every rice paddy in Japan, giving him a precise understanding of the nation's wealth and a basis for a rational tax system. As he aged, however, Hideyoshi's judgment began to fail. His ambition grew into megalomania. He dreamed of conquering not just Japan, but China itself. In the 1590s, he launched two massive, costly, and ultimately disastrous invasions of Korea, which he saw as a stepping stone to the Ming Empire. The invasions bogged down, draining his treasury and costing hundreds of thousands of lives. His behavior became increasingly erratic and paranoid. In a fit of suspicion, he ordered his own nephew and adopted son, Hidetsugu, who he feared was plotting against him, to commit suicide. He then had Hidetsugu's entire family, his wife, children, and consorts, over 30 people in all brutally executed at a riverbank in Kyoto. The great unifier, the brilliant strategist, was descending into a cruel and paranoid tyrant. He died in 1598, leaving behind only a 5-year-old son, Hideyori as his heir, and a council of 5 powerful regents to rule in his placia recipe for disaster. The third and final unifier was the man Hideyoshi had appointed as the most powerful of these regents, Tokugawa Ieyasu. A popular story illustrates the characters of the 3 men. Faced with a cuckoo that would not sing, the ruthless Nobunaga declares, "Kill it." The clever Hideyoshi proclaims, "Make it want to sing." The patient Ieyasu simply says, "I will wait for it to sing." And wait he did. Ieyasu's entire life was a masterclass in patience, endurance, and strategic survival. Sent away as a political hostage in his childhood, he learned from a young age to be cautious, to mask his emotions, and to bide his time. He served as a loyal and effective ally to Nobunaga. After Nobunaga's death, he strategically submitted to Hideyoshi, becoming his most powerful vassal, all the while quietly building his own massive power base in the fertile Kanto plain, centered on the small fishing village of Edo. He served his masters faithfully, but his ultimate ambition was singular: to establish a lasting peace under the rule of his own family. He knew, with an almost supernatural patience, that his time would eventually come. The Tokugawa shogunate and the Great Peace. With Hideyoshi dead, the council of 5 regents he had appointed to protect his young son, Hideyori, quickly fractured. The personal rivalries and ambitions that Hideyoshi's immense authority had kept in check now erupted into the open. The most powerful of the regents, Tokugawa Ieyasu, began making political moves that clearly signaled his intention to seize power for himself. This alarmed the other regents, particularly the loyal and upright Ishida Mitsunari, who began to assemble a coalition of daimyo loyal to the Toyotomi family. By 1600, Japan was once again on the brink of civil war. The country was divided into 2 great factions: the Eastern Army, loyal to Tokugawa Ieyasu, and the Western Army, loyal to Ishida Mitsunari and the heir Hideyori. The decisive confrontation came on October 21, 1600, at the small village of Sekigahara in central Japan. It was the largest and one of the most important battles in Japanese history. Over 160,000 samurai gathered on a foggy, rain-soaked plain for a battle that would determine the fate of the nation for the next 2.5 centuries. The Western Army, though slightly larger, was a fragile coalition of daimyo with varying loyalties. Ieyasu, the master strategist, had exploited this weakness. On the eve of the battle, he had secretly contacted several of the Western commanders, promising them land, titles, and forgiveness if they would betray their comrades. The battle began in a swirl of fog and confusion. The fighting was fierce and desperate for hours, with neither side gaining a clear advantage. But as the day wore on and the fog lifted, Ieyasu gave a prearranged signal. At a crucial moment, several key divisions of the Western Army suddenly switched sides, turning and attacking their own allies from the flank and rear. The betrayal caused the entire Western line to collapse into a panicked rout. The battle turned into a massacre. Ishida Mitsunari was captured and executed. The Western Army was annihilated. Tokugawa Ieyasu was the undisputed master of Japan. 3 years later, in 1603, the emperor, a mere figurehead, granted Ieyasu the title he had long coveted, shogun. He established his capital not in Kyoto or Osaka, but in his own burgeoning castle town of Edo, which would rapidly grow into modern-day Tokyo. The Tokugawa shogunate had begun. Ieyasu, however, knew that military victory was not enough to secure a lasting peace. The Toyotomi family and their loyal daimyo still represented a potential threat. Hideyoshi's son, Hideyori, was now a young man, living in the impregnable fortress of Osaka Castle, a potent symbol of defiance. Ieyasu, patient as ever, waited for an excuse. He found one in a dedication on a temple bell sponsored by Hideyori, claiming the inscription was a curse upon him. In the winter of 1614, Ieyasu led a massive army to besiege Osaka Castle. After a bloody winter campaign, a truce was called, but Ieyasu used the truce to fill in the castle's outer moats, leaving it defenseless. In the summer of 1615, he attacked again. The castle fell, and Hideyori and his mother committed suicide in the flames. The Toyotomi clan was extinguished. The last potential challenge to Tokugawa rule was eliminated. Having unified the country by force, Ieyasu and his successors dedicated themselves to creating a political and social system that would prevent war from ever breaking out again. The Tokugawa shogunate would usher in an era of unprecedented domestic peace, stability, and prosperity that lasted for over 250 years, an era that would become known as the Pax Tokugawa. This great peace was maintained by an iron fist and a brilliantly designed system of social and political control. At the heart of this system was a rigid, four-tiered social hierarchy based on Confucian ideals that was legally enforced. At the very top were the samurai, the ruling warrior administrator class, who constituted about 7 to 10% of the population. Their role was to govern and defend the state. Below them came the farmers and peasants, who made up over 80% of the population and were considered the productive backbone of the nation because they grew the rice that was the basis of the economy. Then came the artisans, who crafted goods, and at the very bottom of the official hierarchy were the merchants. Despite their often immense wealth, they were officially scorned as unproductive parasites who profited from the labor of others. Social mobility between these classes was strictly forbidden. The shogunate in Edo directly controlled about a quarter of the country's land, including all the major cities and mines. The rest of the country was divided into about 250 domains, or han, each ruled by a daimyo. These daimyo were divided into 3 categories based on their relationship to the Tokugawa clan. The Shimpan daimyo were relatives of the shogun. The Fudai daimyo were those who had been loyal vassals of the Tokugawa before the Battle of Sekigahara. And the Tozama, or outside lords, were those who had submitted to Ieyasu only after his victory. These powerful outside lords were viewed with the most suspicion and were placed in domains far from the capital, often surrounded by more trusted Fudai daimyo. To control these powerful and potentially rebellious lords, the shogunate devised a system of breathtaking genius, sankin kotai, or alternate attendants. Every daimyo was required to build a lavish residence in the shogun's capital of Edo and spend every other year living there, under the watchful eye of the government. When the daimyo was permitted to return to his own domain, his wife and heir had to remain behind in Edo, living as permanent, well-treated but undeniable hostages. The enormous financial burden of maintaining 2 grand households sewn in their domain and 1 in Edoland, travelling back and forth in huge, expensive, legally mandated processions kept the daimyo financially crippled and politically powerless, preventing them from ever raising the funds to challenge the shogun. This system also stimulated the economy, created a national network of roads, and fostered a sense of cultural unity centered on the shogun's capital. But what becomes of a warrior class in an age of profound and lasting peace? The samurai, once men whose entire identity was forged in battle, were transformed. With no wars to fight, they evolved into a class of civil administrators, bureaucrats, and scholars. They still wore their two swords as the proud and fearsome symbol of their elite status, and they alone had the right to cut down any commoner who offended them. But their daily lives now consisted of pushing paper in government offices, managing rice warehouses, and enforcing the shogun's laws, rather than storming castles. This long peace created a strange paradox for the samurai. They were the highest social class, the undisputed rulers of the country. But their income was a fixed stipend, paid in rice, determined by the rank of their ancestors. As the commercial economy boomed, the merchant class, officially the lowest, grew fabulously wealthy. Many samurai, especially those of lower rank, found themselves struggling to maintain the lifestyle their status demanded, and often fell into humiliating debt to the very rice merchants they officially despised. The shogun's capital of Edo grew at an explosive rate, becoming one of the largest and most vibrant cities in the world. It was a city of samurai, merchants, and artisans, a bustling center of consumption and culture. A new urban culture flourished, driven by the merchants' wealth and the samurai's leisure time. Publishing houses churned out novels by authors like Ihara Saikaku, whose witty and often racy stories chronicled the lives and loves of the floating world. The bombastic and visually spectacular kabuki theater became the most popular form of entertainment, its star actors becoming national celebrities. The delicate and evocative art of the ukiyo-e, or woodblock print, captured the city's life, depicting its beautiful courtesans, famous kabuki actors, and scenic landscapes. Artists like Hokusai and Hiroshige created images of Japan that would one day captivate the West. The epicenter of this new, vibrant urban culture was a place unlike any other in Japan, a walled, guarded district within Edo known as Yoshiwarathi Pleasure Quarter. For the men of Edo, especially the samurai, it was an escape from the rigid duties, social strictures, and often stifling poverty of their daily lives. A dazzling, lantern-lit dreamland of tea houses, brothels, and theatres, it was a city within a city. A place of fantasy, romance, and sensual pleasure, where, in theory, a man's rank mattered less than the money in his pocket. It was here they spent their time and their stipends, seeking the company of brilliant, highly cultured courtesans and talented female entertainers known as geisha. They called this life ukiyo, the floating world, a term that captured both the district's dazzling glamour and a Buddhist sense of its transient, fleeting pleasure. Yet, even in this era of peace and pleasure-seeking, the old warrior spirit, the samurai code of honor and loyalty, was not dead. It lay dormant, a powerful undercurrent in the national psyche. And in 1703, an incident occurred that would shock the nation and become Japan's most enduring legend of loyalty, a story that perfectly encapsulated the conflict between the warrior's code and the shogun's law. The story began in the shogun's castle in Edo. A minor daimyo from the countryside, Asano Naganori, was tasked with helping to organize a reception for envoys from the imperial court. He was placed under the instruction of a powerful and arrogant court official, Kira Yoshinaka. For reasons that remain debated, perhaps Asano failed to pay a large enough bribe, or perhaps Kira simply disliked the provincial lord. Kira repeatedly insulted and humiliated Asano in public. Finally, pushed beyond his endurance, Asano drew his short sword and struck Kira, wounding him on the face and shoulder. The crime was not the assault itself, but where it had taken place. Drawing a weapon within the shogun's castle was an unforgivable offense, a capital crime. The verdict from the shogun, Tokugawa Tsuneyoshi, was swift and absolute. Lord Asano was ordered to commit seppuku that very day. His domain was confiscated and his family was dispossessed. With their master dead and disgraced, his samurai retainers, now leaderless, became ronin masterless, wave men, set adrift in society. 47 of them, however, led by their wise and patient chamberlain, Oishi Yoshio, swore a secret blood oath to avenge their lord's death and restore his honor. They knew the shogunate spies would be watching them. So, they devised a brilliant deception. They disbanded and scattered across the country, taking up menial jobs as merchants and craftsmen. Their leader, Oishi, moved to Kyoto and cultivated the image of a broken man. He frequented the brothels of Gion, drank to excess, and engaged in shameful behavior, all to convince Lord Kira and the authorities that he had abandoned the way of the samurai. The deception was so convincing that it is said a samurai from Satsuma province once stumbled upon Oishi passed out drunk in the street and spat on him in contempt for betraying his master's memory. For nearly 2 years, they waited, lulling their enemy into a false sense of security. But in secret, they were plotting. They smuggled weapons into Edo, studied maps of Kira's mansion, and prepared for their attack. Then, on a snowy winter night in January of 1703, they gathered. 47 ronin, dressed in makeshift armor, converged on Lord Kira's mansion in Edo. They launched a stealthy, perfectly executed attack, overwhelming Kira's own samurai guards in a fierce battle. After a frantic search, they found the terrified official hiding in a storage shed. Oishi Yoshio respectfully knelt before him and, explaining their purpose, offered him the same short sword his master Asano had used to commit seppuku, giving him the opportunity to die an honorable samurai's death. When the trembling Kira refused, Oishi beheaded him. Their mission of vengeance complete, they extinguished the fires in the mansion and marched in a silent, grim procession across the city to the Sengakuji temple where their master was buried. They washed Kira's severed head in a nearby well and placed it reverently on Lord Asano's tomb, along with the dagger that had ended his life. They had restored their master's honor. Having achieved their goal, they calmly turned themselves in to the authorities. The shogunate was faced with a profound dilemma. The ronin had acted out of perfect bushido, the warrior's code of loyalty, an ideal the government itself promoted. But they had also blatantly defied the shogun's law by carrying out a private vendetta. After months of public debate that captivated the nation, the verdict came down. While the shogun sympathized with their loyalty, the law could not be ignored. The ronin were sentenced to death, but they were granted the honor of committing seppuku rather than being executed as common criminals. In February 1703, the 47 ronin, save one who had been sent as a messenger, knelt and took their own lives. They were buried next to their master at Sengakuji, becoming instant national heroes, their story immortalized in countless kabuki plays, woodblock prints, and legends, the ultimate, tragic embodiment of the samurai spirit. The Locked Country and the Dutch Window. The Tokugawa peace was built on a foundation of absolute control, and the greatest threat to that control, in the eyes of the shogunate, came from the outside world. In the century before Tokugawa Ieyasu unified the country, Japan had its first intensive contact with Europe. Portuguese traders arrived in 1543, bringing with them not just firearms, but also a new and fervent religion, Christianity. Catholic missionaries, particularly the disciplined and intellectually rigorous Jesuits, led by Francis Xavier, had remarkable success in Japan, converting hundreds of thousands, including several daimyo. At first, the warlords, including Oda Nobunaga, welcomed the foreigners and their technology. But as the country was unified, the shogunate began to view Christianity with deep suspicion. It was an alien creed that taught loyalty to a foreign pope and a single god above loyalty to one's daimyo and the shogun. It was seen as a tool of European colonial ambition, a Christian century in Japan that had to be stopped. The shoguns feared that this foreign religion would undermine the very fabric of their carefully constructed social and political order. Starting in the early 17th century, the shogunate launched a brutal and systematic persecution. Missionaries were expelled, and Japanese Christians were forced to publicly renounce their faith, often by trampling on a crucifix or an image of the Virgin Mary in a ceremony called fumi-e. Those who refused faced horrific tortures. They were branded, burned, or hung upside down in pits of filth until they recanted or died. They became martyrs for their faith. This fear of foreign influence culminated in the 1630s with the enactment of the Sakoku, or locked country policies. A series of edicts were passed that effectively sealed Japan off from the rest of the world. All Japanese were forbidden from leaving the country on pain of death. Any Japanese who was already abroad was forbidden from ever returning. All European traders, except for a small group of Dutch, were expelled. The final act that cemented this policy of isolation was the Shimabara Rebellion of 1637 to 1638. What began as a desperate peasant uprising against crushing taxes on the Shimabara Peninsula near Nagasaki was fanned into a massive revolt by years of religious persecution. Tens of thousands of peasants, many of them recent Christian converts, were joined by masterless ronin. They made their last stand in the ruins of Hara Castle, flying banners with Christian slogans and fighting with a desperate ferocity. The shogun's elite samurai armies struggled for months to crush the rebellion. In the end, they were forced to request the help of the Dutch, who used the powerful cannons of their ships to bombard the castle walls. The rebellion was finally extinguished in a sea of blood, with an estimated 37,000 rebels and their supporters massacred. The Shimabara Rebellion was the last major military conflict in Japan for over 200 years, and it hardened the shogunate's resolve. The doors to the world were slammed shut and locked tight. One tiny window was left ajar. On the small fan-shaped artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki Harbor, a small contingent of Protestant Dutch traders was allowed to remain. The Dutch were tolerated because they were seen as interested purely in trade, not in spreading religion. They were the only Europeans permitted in the country. Their lives were heavily restricted. They were effectively prisoners on their island, their every move watched and controlled by the Japanese authorities. They were only allowed to leave the island once a year for the long and ceremonial journey to Edo to pay their respects to the shogun. It was through this single tiny pinhole that Japan maintained its only contact with Europe for the next 2 centuries. And through this same narrow channel, Western knowledge, known as Rangaku or Dutch learning, trickled into Japan. Small groups of dedicated Japanese scholars and interpreters in Nagasaki, defying the official policy of isolation and the deep-seated suspicion of foreign ideas, secretly studied Dutch books on medicine, astronomy, botany, chemistry, and military science. In 1771, a group of Japanese physicians, led by Sugita Genpaku, obtained a Dutch book on anatomy. they managed to observe the dissection of an executed criminal. They were stunned to find that the Dutch anatomical charts were perfectly accurate, while the traditional Chinese medical texts they had studied were vague and often wrong. The experience was a revelation. Sugita and his colleagues worked for years to translate the Dutch text, publishing the New Book of Anatomy in 1774. It was a landmark event, sparking a growing interest in Western science and demonstrating that there was a world of empirical knowledge outside of Asia that was powerful and useful. Rangaku remained a fringe and often dangerous pursuit, but it planted the seeds of scientific and industrial thought that would become critically important when Japan's isolation was finally broken. The Black Ships and the end of isolation. By the mid-19th century, the Tokugawa shogunate, after more than 2 centuries of peace, was beginning to show its age. The economy was stagnating, a series of famines had caused widespread suffering, and peasant uprisings were becoming more frequent. The rigid social order was breaking down as impoverished samurai fell into debt to wealthy merchants. The government seemed incapable of solving these internal problems. And now, a new and far more dangerous threat was looming on the horizon. The outside world, which Japan had kept at bay for so long, was changing rapidly. The Industrial Revolution had created powerful new empires in the West Britain, France, Russia, and the United States with global ambitions, advanced technology, and powerful steam-powered navies. These nations were aggressively expanding their trade and influence across Asia, and they would not tolerate a nation that refused to engage with them. Whaling ships and naval vessels began appearing with increasing frequency in Japanese waters, probing the country's defenses and demanding the opening of its ports. Then, on July 8, 1853, the inevitable happened. Into the calm waters of Edo Bay, just miles from the shogun's capital, steamed a squadron of 4 American warships. They were unlike anything the Japanese had ever seen. Huge black-hulled vessels that moved ominously against the wind, their tall smokestacks belching acrid black smoke. The Japanese, terrified and awestruck by this display of industrial power, called them the Kuro Funnieth Black Ships. Their commander was Commodore Matthew C. Perry of the United States Navy. He was a stern, determined veteran on a mission from the American President Millard Fillmore. He carried a letter demanding that Japan abandon its policy of isolation, open its ports to American trade, guarantee the humane treatment of shipwrecked sailors, and allow American ships to take on coal and provisions. Perry made it clear that these were not requests but demands backed by the threat of his ship's massive cannons, which could easily reduce Edo to ashes. He refused to deal with low-level officials, demanding to present his letter to the highest authorities. After a tense standoff, the shogunate, unnerved by his show of force, agreed to accept the letter. Perry then announced that he would depart, but would return the following year with an even larger fleet for the shogun's answer. The arrival of the black ships plunged the Tokugawa shogunate into a crisis from which it would never recover. It was a profound national humiliation, exposing the country's military weakness for all to see. For the first time in its 250-year history, the government was paralyzed by indecision. In an unprecedented and fatal sign of weakness, the shogunate broke with tradition and polled all the daimyo for their advice on how to respond. This act shattered the image of Tokugawa authority and opened the floodgates of national debate. The country immediately split into opposing factions. On one side were the realists, or kaikoku, open the country, who argued that Japan could not possibly resist the West's military power and must open its doors to learn its technology in order to survive. On the other side were the hardliners, the Joi, expel the barbarian, faction who argued for a policy of militant resistance, calling for a national mobilization to defend the sacred soil of Japan from the foreign devils. This expel the barbarian sentiment quickly merged with a renewed reverence for the emperor in Kyoto, who had been a political non-entity for centuries, but was now being promoted as the true, divine symbol of the nation. The slogan Sono Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, became the rallying cry for a powerful anti-shogunate movement. When Perry returned, as promised in February 1854, this time with a fleet of 9 warships, the shogunate had no choice. Faced with overwhelming military superiority, they signed the Treaty of Kanagawa, opening 2 ports to American ships and ending over 200 years of self-imposed isolation. This was soon followed by similar treaties with Britain, Russia, and the Netherlands. The doors to the world had been kicked open. The fall of the shogunate and the Meiji Restoration. The signing of the unequal treaties was a national disgrace that fatally undermined the authority of the Tokugawa shogunate. The government created to subdue barbarians had proven itself incapable of the task. The 1850s and 1860s, a period known as the Bakumatsu, the end of the Bakufu, were a time of immense political turmoil, intrigue, and violence. The Sono Joy movement intensified, led by young, radical, lower-ranking samurai who carried out a campaign of assassination against shogunate officials and foreigners. The center of this anti-shogunate movement was in the great outside domains of Western Japan, particularly Choshu and Satsuma, who had been rivals of the Tokugawa since the Battle of Sekigahara. These powerful domains, using the slogan of imperial reverence as a justification, began to build up their own military forces, often using Western technology and tactics. After years of complex political maneuvering, assassinations, and several brief but bloody civil conflicts, these 2 great rival domains, brokered by idealistic samurai like Sakamoto Ryoma, formed a secret alliance. Their goal was no longer just to influence the shogunate, but to overthrow it entirely and establish a new government centered on the emperor. The final conflict, the Boshin War, erupted in late 1867. The forces of Satsuma and Choshu, now fighting as the imperial army, marched on Kyoto. The 15th and final shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, a capable and intelligent man, realized his position was untenable. Hoping to preempt the rebellion and preserve the Tokugawa clan's influence in a new form of government, he formally resigned his title and returned political power to the young Emperor Meiji in November 1867. But it was too little, too late. The leaders of Satsuma and Choshu were not interested in a power-sharing arrangement. They wanted the complete and total destruction of the Tokugawa clan's power. In January 1868, they seized the imperial palace in Kyoto and had the young emperor issue a decree that abolished the shogunate and ordered the confiscation of all Tokugawa lands. The Boshin War now began in earnest, pitting the modernized imperial army against the more traditional forces still loyal to the Tokugawa. The war culminated in the surrender of Edo in the spring of 1868, which was renamed Tokyo the Eastern Capital. After some final pockets of resistance in the north were crushed, the war was over. The Tokugawa shogunate, after 265 years, was finished. The age of the shogun was over. On January 3, 1868, the Meiji Restoration was formally proclaimed. On the surface, it was a restoration of direct imperial rule. In reality, power was now held by a small group of ambitious and brilliant young samurai, mostly from Satsuma and Choshu, who would rule in the emperor's name. These men, the Meiji oligarchs, were not traditionalists. They were pragmatists who understood that Japan had to modernize, and modernize rapidly if it was to avoid the fate of China and other Asian nations that had been colonized by the West. Their goal was to create a rich country with a strong army, Fukoku Kyohei, and they embarked on a breathtakingly rapid program of industrialization, political reform, and social transformation. To do this, they believed they had to dismantle the old feudal system entirely. In a series of radical moves, they abolished the four-tiered social hierarchy. They persuaded the daimyo to voluntarily surrender their domains to the emperor, and then replaced the 250 feudal han with a modern system of prefectures controlled by a central government. And then they did the unthinkable. They abolished the samurai class itself, the very class to which they belonged. The hereditary stipends that had been the samurai's livelihood for centuries were converted into government bonds, often at a fraction of their former value. Finally, in 1876, a law was passed forbidding anyone other than soldiers and police from wearing swords in public. The daisho, the paired swords that were the very soul and symbol of the samurai, were outlawed. The samurai were stripped of their privileges, their income, and their identity. This final act was too much for some. In 1877, Saigo Takamori, one of the most beloved heroes of the Meiji Restoration, a man from Satsuma often called the last true samurai, led a massive rebellion of thousands of disgruntled former samurai against the new government he had helped create. The Satsuma Rebellion was the last stand of the old Japan against the new. Saigo's samurai, armed with swords and traditional weapons, fought with incredible courage, but they were no match for the new Imperial Japanese Army, a modern conscript force armed with rifles, cannons, and Gatling guns. The rebellion was crushed, and Saigo Takamori died on the battlefield, a final, tragic hero of a vanquished age. The shogunate was gone. The samurai were no more. In just a single generation, a way of life that had defined Japan for nearly a millennium had vanished. Yet, the legacy of that era was not erased. The samurai spirit, with its emphasis on discipline, loyalty, self-sacrifice, and devotion to a higher cause, was not destroyed. It was rechanneled, from serving a feudal lord to serving the modern nation-state, fueling Japan's miraculous transformation from an isolated feudal country into a major industrial and military world power. The story of the samurai and the shoguns had ended, but their shadow would stretch long across the 20th century and beyond, a timeless saga of power, honor, and a world of warriors now lost to history.